Imagine standing at the gates of a dying kingdom. Behind you, men who no longer remember what unified command looks like. Ahead of you, 25,000 warriors who move together like a single fist. Not just soldiers marching in formation. Warriors who had spent months in the earth, who had learned to move as one organism, who had forgotten mercy because mercy was a luxury their world never taught them. And between you and them, a choice that was never really a choice at all. This is the story of the day a kingdom fell, not to superior numbers, to something far more deadly, to the moment when a nation turned on itself. Welcome to the channel. If you are curious about the moments that broke the world, you are in the right place. Now listen, history does not often give us days that change everything. But on the 21st of March, in the year 867, in a Roman city that the Anglo-Saxons called Eoforwic and the Vikings would rename Jorvik, everything changed. What happened there was not a battle in the way we imagine battles. It was not two armies of equal purpose meeting on equal ground. It was the execution of an invasion by an enemy that had already won, not with spears, but with patience, not with fury, but with understanding. The enemy understood something that the men defending the city did not. They understood that kingdoms do not fall from without, they fall from within. And on that gray March morning, when two kings, two bitter enemies forced into an alliance too late, led their soldiers into the narrow streets of York, they walked not into victory, they walked into a trap laid by men who had studied them for 5 months. The story begins not in 867. It begins in 866. It begins in autumn, when a fleet of Viking longships appeared at the mouth of the Humber. 25,000 men emerged from those ships. They came from Denmark, from Norway, from the settlements of Ireland, and the warrior societies of Frisia. They came under the command of two names that would echo through English chronicles for centuries. Ubba, a general of such reputation that simply his arrival on a coast was enough to shake the resolve of entire shires. And Ivar the Boneless, a man whose legend preceded him so completely that English soldiers trembled at the sound of his approach. They came with a singular purpose: revenge. According to the Norse sagas, according to the memories of the North, they came because the king of Northumbria, a man named Ela, had executed one of the greatest legends of Scandinavia, Ragnar Lothbrok. The fathers avenged, the sons came to settle the debt. But here is where history becomes something darker than simple revenge. Here is where we discover something about human nature that was just as true in the 9th century as it remains true today. The kingdom these warriors had come to conquer was already at war with itself. Northumbria, in 866, was not a unified kingdom. It was a battlefield of wills. Years earlier, a man named Osbert had sat on the throne. He was the legitimate king. The records call him weak, not in courage, but in resolve. Not in strength, but in the ruthlessness required to hold a kingdom during times of strain. And so when a powerful nobleman named Ela rose against him, offering the promise of order where Osbert offered uncertainty, the nobility made their choice. They cast Osbert down. They placed the crown on Ela's head. Ela promised security. Ela promised strength. Ela, according to the chronicles, was a tyrant. And then the Vikings arrived. What happened next was not resistance. Resistance requires unity. What happened was panic. Ela, sitting uneasily on a throne that half of Northumbria resented him for holding, found himself facing an invasion force that dwarfed anything his nation could produce. He could not defend the kingdom. He could not defend the capital. But here is what he could do. He could reach out to the one man he had deposed. He could ask for help. In November of 866, the news came to Osbert, the former king, the man Ela had thrown down. And Osbert, either from patriotism or from the recognition that a Scandinavian-dominated Northumbria would be far worse than Ela's tyranny, agreed to fight alongside the man who had stolen his throne. They marched toward York together. But by the time Osbert and Ela arrived at the city walls, it was already lost. On the 1st of November, the Vikings had taken York. They had moved with such speed, such organization, such overwhelming tactical precision, that the city's defenses, old Roman walls, crumbling and neglected, had shattered before the assembled might of the Great Heathen Army. The chroniclers recorded that the Northumbrians made little resistance. Why? Because a kingdom at civil war cannot mount a resistance. A kingdom at civil war can only fracture further. The Vikings had not conquered Northumbria with superior tactics. They had simply arrived at the moment when Northumbria was in the process of conquering itself. For 5 months, 5 long months, Osbert and Ayla sat outside those walls. They tried to devise strategies. They discussed building bridges across the river to cut off the Viking fleet. They gathered reinforcements from the south. They waited for Ealdorman Egbert and Rixiga to arrive with their armies. But the waiting itself was a kind of agony. Because every day they waited, the Vikings inside the city were consolidating power. They were repairing the ancient Roman walls. They were establishing supply lines. They were training, drilling, preparing. They were forging unity out of a force that had arrived as a coalition of Norse kingdoms and Irish settlements and Frisian mercenaries. The Great Heathen Army was becoming something unified. It was becoming an empire. And then spring came. March arrived with rain and mud and the kind of desperation that comes from understanding that delay has become your enemy. Osbert and Ayla, former enemies now bound by the precarious alliance of necessity, made a decision. They would attack. Together. On the 21st of March, 867, they led their forces toward the city gates. What followed was one of the most consequential hours in English history. The Northumbrians broke through the walls. The chronicles record it. They got inside the city. For a moment, for an instant, it seemed as though the impossible might happen. 2 kings, their forces united, their enemy cornered within ancient stone walls. Victory seemed possible. And then the streets became everything. The Vikings had spent 5 months in York learning its layout. They understood something that the Northumbrians did not. In the wide-open fields of pitched battle, armies win through numbers and formation and the charge of cavalry. In the narrow Roman streets of York, armies win through something else entirely. They win through discipline. They win through understanding terrain. They win through the ability to move as a coordinated organism rather than as individuals. The Northumbrians had come with numbers. The Vikings had come with precision. The fighting that erupted in those streets was not the kind of warfare that generates glory in the sagas. It was messy. It was brutal. It was a grinding, methodical dissolution of one army by another. The Vikings used formations that turned the narrow streets into killing grounds. They used tactics that compressed the Northumbrian advantage in numbers into a disadvantage. They moved like an organism with a single nervous system, while the Northumbrians moved like fragments of a kingdom that had never fully unified, even in the face of extinction. And in the chaos of those narrow streets, 2 things happened that would change the course of English history. The first king fell. Ayla, the usurper, the tyrant, the man who had called for help from the king he had deposed, died in those streets. Some legends said the Vikings executed him with ritual. The Norse sagas spoke of the blood eagle, a legendary execution of such brutality that even historians are not entirely certain it was ever truly performed. But whether myth or reality, the result was the same. Ayla's reign ended not with a crown, but with a corpse left in the mud of his own capital. And then Osbert fell. The legitimate king. The man whose throne had been stolen. The man who had swallowed his pride and his anger and his legitimate claim to power in order to defend a kingdom that no longer remembered his name. He died in the same streets, fighting the same enemy, in the same battle that killed the man who had deposed him. 2 kings, 1 day, 1 city. And suddenly, Northumbria no longer had a kingdom. What happened next was not conquest in the traditional sense. It was transformation. The Vikings established control over York. They installed a king, a man named Egbert, but everyone understood what he was. Not a king, a puppet, a vessel for Viking power. And what had once been an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom became something new. It became Jorvik, a Viking city, a center of Norse power in the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. And the kingdom of Northumbria ceased to exist as an independent force. Drop a comment if you want to know how a puppet kingdom carved the future of a nation. But here is what makes this moment matter beyond the immediate tragedy. Here is what makes York 867 a watershed in human history. This was not merely the fall of a city. This was the fall of an age. The Great Heathen Army had come to England with a single purpose. They had come as raiders become conquerors. And at York, they proved something that would change the entire course of the next 5 centuries. They proved that a disciplined force could establish permanent control over occupied territories. They proved that conquest was possible. They proved that the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, for all their martial tradition and warrior culture, could be defeated and displaced. And they proved it not through simple superiority in numbers or weapons, but through the combination of 3 things: superior organization, patience, and the willingness to exploit their enemies' internal divisions. Think about what this means. The Vikings did not win because they had more warriors than Northumbria. They had more warriors than any single region of Northumbria. But what they truly possessed was something far more valuable. They possessed unity. They possessed a command structure that worked. They possessed 10 men who thought as one, and that single, unified will proved capable of controlling 25,000 warriors across months of occupation and strategic maneuvering. The Northumbrians had 25,000 warriors too, spread across the kingdom, fragmented by loyalty to different lords, divided by the question of which king was legitimate, paralyzed by the civil conflict that had defined their realm for years. When those warriors finally united, it was too late. The moment of possible victory had passed. The psychological weight of what happened at York spread through England like a plague. Messengers rode south. The news reached the courts of other kingdoms, carried in the voices of men who had survived the streets of York. Northumbria, a major power with ancient prestige, with a warrior tradition stretching back centuries, had fallen. Not to an external force of obviously superior size, but to an invasion that had exploited internal fracture. The message was clear. A kingdom divided could not stand. A kingdom at civil war was already half defeated. A kingdom that could not choose a single king would fall to enemies who could move as one. And the Vikings had proven this lesson in blood. In the 5 years that followed, the Great Heathen Army would systematically dismantle the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. East Anglia would fall. Mercia would be carved in half. Only Wessex would survive, and only because one man, Alfred, would eventually understand what the Vikings understood about the nature of power. That territory mattered less than unity. That symbols mattered less than strategy. That sometimes holding power meant knowing when to negotiate as well as when to fight. But that is a story for another moment. For now, we must sit with what happened on that gray March morning in 867. We must understand that when men say kingdoms fall, they do not always mean that invaders arrive and conquer them with overwhelming force. Sometimes kingdoms fall because they tear themselves apart from within. Sometimes the greatest enemy is the mirror. And sometimes the moment that changes the course of history is not a moment of glorious battle, but a moment of grim necessity. 2 enemies forced to stand together against a larger tide, only to discover that they stood too late, that their unity came too slowly, that the enemy they faced had already learned every secret of their divided kingdom. This is why York matters. Not because of the blood spilled, or the tactics employed, or the numbers that fought there, but because it teaches us something timeless about power, about the nature of civilization. about the way that discipline and patience and the willingness to exploit weakness can accomplish what brute force alone can never achieve. The Vikings did not break Northumbria at York. Northumbria broke itself. The Vikings simply understood how to stand in that moment of fracture and push. And that is why, more than 1,000 years later, we still remember that day. Not as a great victory, but as a turning point. The moment when one world began to end, and another world began to take its place. The day when a kingdom fell not because it was weak, but because it forgot what kingdoms require: unity, purpose, and a single will expressed through a single voice. On the 21st of March, 867, 2 kings died in the streets of York. When they fell, something else fell with them: an entire age. An entire way of understanding power and territory and what a kingdom could be. And what rose in their place was something new, something that would reshape the map of the world for centuries to come. This is the story of the day a kingdom fell, not to overwhelming force, to the weight of its own divisions, and to the patience of enemies who understood that sometimes the greatest victory does not come from the strength of your army. It comes from the weakness of your enemy's will to remain unified. The Great Heathen Army succeeded at York not because they were invincible. They succeeded because they arrived at a kingdom that was already tearing itself apart. And they had the discipline, the organization, and the strategic vision to stand in that moment of fracture and ensure that Northumbria would never again rise as an independent power. That is the legacy. That is what history remembers, and that is why, even now, the fall of York resonates through the centuries. A reminder that civilizations do not fall to their enemies, they fall to themselves. And the greatest conquerors are simply the ones patient and disciplined enough to wait for that moment of internal collapse.